Thank you. And for the sake of the camera, I'll say it is a packed room this morning. So I kind of want to just first show you this. It's an article, source, if you will, a text. And back in 2008, this source was picked up by the Beijing Evening News and broadcast actually live on television and discussed. And it is, in fact, if you have a little sourcing experience yourself, an article from The Onion, so it's entirely fictitious. But the paper, the Beijing Evening News, the editor got defensive when they challenged his kind of choice for putting this on the air. And he says, well, how can you prove it's not correct? And the editor demanded, and he also said, is it incorrect just because you say it is? And then, of course, the editor of The Onion was very willing to admit that, this is satire, this isn't real, and this is like the true purpose. So, of course, the article is great because they were proposing to put a retractable dome on the Congress building, and the article talks about how, there were Congress members that were threatening to, leave Congress if it wasn't done. So, as bizarre as it sounds, it was picked up and broadcast, and so kind of a humorous kind of quip about how sources are important and how we evaluate them also being pretty important. This one's a little more personal and a little less humorous. My niece was shot and killed a couple years ago, and it was a tragic incident. She was going to Gary to buy pot with some friends, and it went bad, and she got shot and passed. But this is an article that was written about it less than 24 hours after the crime had taken place. And if you kind of just peruse the details, there's some signals here that tell you that something's not quite right with the article when you start evaluating it a little bit more. For instance, some of the language use of the author. The media is downplaying the black on white hate crime as a drug deal gone wrong. In reality, she was forced to go to a public school with over 60% African American population. So you can tell just by the language of the article how charged this is. So naturally, my family in a time of grief reading this is just, very frustrated and angry. And however, a lot of people get their news from this website. It's actually the Conservative Post, believe it or not, published this within 8 hours of the crime taking place. So that's a little more grim. I assure you we won't stay that dark the entire time, but I offer these as kind of underscoring the importance of how we evaluate sources. I'm talking about historical reasoning, so it's going back a little further, but these skills are very transferable when we evaluate sources. So all that to say that the title of today's talk is The Journey, Not the Destination. And I'm interested in looking at students' historical reasoning while they write in history. And perhaps it's because I'm now in my last and final year of the program and getting sentimental thinking about the journey rather than the destination at the end. However, the focus of my talk today is really about looking at the process rather than the end product, particularly when it comes to students writing in history. So that said, today I'll be talking about a couple different things. I want to introduce you and perhaps reintroduce you to some of the work of Project Ready and the history design team that was housed here at UIC for many years. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the history team and the learning goals and introduce you to that project because it's within that context that most of my work was situated over the last few years. And so I'll be sharing some of the results of Study 2, and I'll kind of give you more details about Study 1, which really kind of gives you an idea of what I've done in the program over the last few years. So Study 1 is actually my research apprenticeship, which takes place in our second or third year of the program, and then Study 2 is kind of a slice of my ongoing dissertation work. So with that, I invite you to ask clarifying questions along the way because it isn't a huge crowd, and I feel like this is a combination of presentations because I'm kind of providing some commentary or meta-commentary on my experiences and my development of a conceptual framework over the last few years, but also kind of couching it in this like process of multiple studies over time. So feel free to ask clarifying questions. So my background, real quickly for you, and just some kind of important things to note. When I first got started here, I was conscribed to a program called the CCLCP, or the Chicago Civic Engagement Certificate Program at UIC. With a background in English education, I was very interested in how students wrote. Not just how they wrote, but really that product. You know, what could I do to improve the product of students' writing, right? And so I had a very fixed idea of what I thought writing was as a novice teacher. Moving into the learning sciences and spending more time thinking about writing, of course, I began to think about the process. And so my ideas about writing began to shift. And so the CCLCP is actually a pretty unique program in which the first 2 years of your stay at UIC, select students, they apply to be in this program, they'd be partnered with nonprofit institutions around Chicago in which they got to basically intern there or work for free each semester. So they'd have about 4 internships over their course of their freshman and sophomore year. And the purpose of this was to help them view writing as situated and view writing as having consequences in the real world. So they got to see their writing actually play out with these organizations and see it have some sort of effect. So as I went through that kind of experience doing a program evaluation with them, my ideas about writing began to shift towards viewing writing as this practice that actually is so small soapbox here, little side note. You know the writing process that you get taught in school where it's like pre-writing, invention, and then you draft, you revise, and then eventually you publish. And that kind of last step, that publishing piece, often gets ignored in schools, right? Students hand it in to the teacher, they evaluate it, get a grade, they pass it back, it's done. So students don't get to experience what it's like to really publish or get a piece of writing and see it have consequences outside of themselves. And so that program kind of gave me a lens into viewing writing as more of a process than just this static product that happens inside of a vacuum and disappears. Excuse me. So I just wanted to make note to Julia Emig back in 1977 publishing a piece in I think it's like Communications or a writing journal, advancing the idea that when you write, you are thinking. And I'm going to talk a little more about that in the context of history a little bit more. So Project Ready, let me give you kind of the big picture here if you're not familiar with it already. Most of my research, or all of it, is kind of couched in Project Ready, which was a large 6-year multi-institutional grant housed here at UIC with Susan Goldman as the PI. And the focus of it was to design and test inquiry-based instructional interventions in the disciplines of science, literature, and history. And they had an emphasis on evidence-based argumentation with multiple texts in these disciplines. Can you make an argument in these disciplines with multiple sources? And so they had a design-based research approach in which we iteratively designed instructional approaches on the project. Now, with a background in English, it would stand to reason that I might be involved in the literature team of that project. However, given the size of the project, it was not convenient for me to be on a team of that size. And when I did transition to Project Ready, we thought it good that I spend some time moving to the history team. And so I kind of got couched there. I'm like, I like history. Let me do history for a while. And so so that's kind of how I ended up there. It was a simple function of small interest in history and convenience at the time. And I'm glad I did, because it's really kind of shaped where I ended up. So so on the project, there were disciplinary teams, one for science, one for literature, one for history. They were design teams. And I was on the history design team. And I want to mention that it was a collaboration of researchers and disciplinary experts and teachers, learning scientists. And I want to kind of underscore the teachers here, because I feel like it's an integral part of the design work that Ready did was collaborating and partnering with teachers to create and design. So I think that was important and unique. And just to give some context in terms of the conceptual framework here, the team viewed history learning and as a historical inquiry with an emphasis on disciplinary practices. So the idea here being, you don't want students to just learn history content. We want students to actually do history. So we want them to adopt the practices or certain practices of historians and engage in the actual discipline. Susan last week actually mentioned at a talk this quote that someone used to quip on the history design team, which is, history is argument without end, or endless argument. And I found out that it's actually from a Dutch historiographer, Peter Geil, I guess, or Gale, who originally said that. But it's the idea that someone can always argue with the interpretations that a historian advances. And we can also come to different historical sources with different perspectives and different understandings of those sources. So, as part of the design process, there were learning goals developed, of course, and I kind of want to introduce you to just a few of those for a moment. So I'm about to blast you with a big block of text, which I never like to do, but too bad. So here are the 6 learning goals of the project. Over the course of the years, these were developed and used to help us design. And just kind of a quick overview of these, it began with close reading practices, the notion that if the students can't read carefully, they're not going to be able to really get to do more of the analytical work with historical reasoning. The second being analyze sources, which I'll talk a little bit more in a bit. Construct claim-evidence relationships, so can they argue, can they make a claim using evidence from historical sources? Interpretive frameworks, the use of historical frameworks, so those are societal structures, things in history that historians use, like the feudal system, or taking an economic perspective and making an argument using principles of economics, for instance. So you could view the Civil War from a kind of a critical perspective, or you can view it from an economic perspective, perhaps, right? Evaluating historical interpretations, and this kind of goes to challenging or questioning the author of like history texts, and can they recognize that history texts and arguments have perspective and argument. And then finally, we were interested in shifting the student's view of history and moving it from this idea that history is static and again just a series of events to something more interpretive, that history itself is an interpretive act, an interpretive discipline in which history is an approximation of the past. So that's kind of the overview. More specifically to the second point about analyzing sources, I'd be remiss if I didn't talk briefly or introduce you to Weinberg's work, if you're not already familiar with Sam Weinberg's work and the history team out at Stanford. Back in 1991, Weinberg sat down with historians and had them do think-alouds while they read history sources. And he had a range of historians from with different specialties in this mix, but they all kind of surfaced the same practices as they read these sources. Now, he called them heuristics, and later on the research community really picked these up and adopted them as thinking skills, they began to call them. And those are sourcing, contextualization, and corroboration. And so just to quickly survey that for you, sourcing is when we approach a text and we begin to question its author. Why was this created? What's the purpose of it? When was it written? Interrogating the kind of the context and the details of it. Contextualization is situating history sources in place and time, and then corroborating, which is verifying information within and across different sources and doing some comparison work as well. Again, these are the three that I was particularly interested in because I think my work speaks most directly to it. The third one about constructing claims evidence relationships, again, can they advance a claim using sources about history? And then finally, that epistemic goal I've kind of already mentioned. a little bit further. So I want to kind of give my voice a break just for a moment and have you do something for me, if you will. Quick exercise. I'd like you to take about a minute here and source this document. And when I say source, I want you to think about who wrote it, why was it created, and I provided this common acronym that history classes now use to help you think about that source. So SOAPSTONE is the acronym. Think about the speaker of this document, the occasion, the audience purpose, subject, tone, and those three heuristics I've also thrown up there just to keep them in the back of your mind. And the sourcing information or the caption is in the upper right for you. So spend about 60 seconds, and why don't you talk to someone nearby you about what you're seeing, if you don't mind, if you entertain me for a second. And go. Yes.
Just from the picture?
You don't have to carefully analyze this text out here, or just contextualizing this document written
I would think this is supposed to be context.
I don't think it's a real. It can't be from 1770. It's got color. I think it's fake news.
Yeah, probably not the best idea because you guys just died. Yeah. So I guess on the speaker would be. I mean, it's a Boston publisher, but I think it would be somebody from. I think side.
Focusing it
and I think the audience would be.
I mean, the fact that I think that there's minimal text is a huge picture that you can
Strength of one side and then side.
Yeah. Might say something about its purpose. Maybe.
Almost to incite chaos, right? Just from looking at the picture. I do know about
You don't see a single person on the left carrying arms whatsoever. It's the innocent people.
And you see the puppy. It's not even a dog, it's a puppy.
Bloody massacre.
Right, so they have come up to this innocent group of people who just like out chilling with their puppy and just shot them dead.
That's why
And it looks like the one woman over there in the crowd.
All right, so I'm going to cut you off. I don't know if that was 2 minutes. I have no sense of rhythm or time, and so I don't have an internal clock that would have told me 2 minutes. I should have looked. I'm going to guess here. So what I kind of just want to jot down real quick is just your thoughts or what you noticed about this document. What sense can we make of it as a group? Beginning with any detail you might have noticed.
Showing one-sided strength and control and vulnerability on the other side.
So strength, so that's what you're seeing in the image, right?
Yeah.
Control, and you said vulnerability?
Yeah.
Ability, perhaps? Right? Vulnerability? My spelling isn't great. Yeah, so that's what you're kind of observing from the actual image itself. Sure, yeah.
If it says the source is Paul Revere, then we know going into it that he's got a pretty clear bias as far as which side.
Okay, you just mentioned bias, but you're saying the writer of this or the speaker, the S, is Paul Revere, right? And you can gather that just from the sourcing information. And what do you mean by bias? Like, why is he biased?
History is not my most confident subject, but Paul Revere is the...
You're all doing great.
The British are coming, he's from the revolutionary side of it, so he is going to be in favor of the revolution and against the British Army.
So Paul Revere himself, you've just added some contextual details about him. He is a revolutionary, right, of that period, and that he had a very specific perspective, which is he supported the revolution, right? Yeah, how might that influence what you see depicted here? And that's not to pick on you, but really anyone. Why might that matter? Yeah.
He's probably trying to vilify the British side.
Yeah, I'm going to just stop writing because it's not actually productive. But yeah, he's perhaps vilifying the British, okay? Yeah, Dane.
Well, the fact that we're giving it such a charged title, the Bloody Massacre, why didn't we just call it, the skirmish on King Street? So there's clearly a choice of language that Paul Revere is making to indicate that this is an aggressive act of the British against the colonists, who are depicted here without any weapons.
And defenseless.
With a puppy.
With a puppy.
Puppies are very useful for contemporary.
Just on little old Queen Street in their city in Boston, right?
So we talked about the purpose of that as being to incite the defenseless side to bear arms and fight back.
Other thoughts?
Yeah, even in the text, there's a couple of words I can see, words like victims, and we should deplore this, and like it's a call to outrage.
Deplorable, right? Mm-hmm. Excellent. So this is a common primary source used in revolutionary units, and they're often, sometimes even found within a textbook in a little margin about this big. Students would never be able to read this. And it would have a caption that just describes to you what you're looking at. The interesting thing about this source in particular is this was probably the most effective piece of revolutionary propaganda at its time. It was published in the newspaper 3 weeks after the actual skirmish happened. I like your choice of words. And it is a very inaccurate depiction in terms of the image of what happened. The regiment was not lined up in a firing line as if they were going off to battle. And a total of 5 people died in this incident. And actually one African American, which is also not depicted here. But yeah, a very effective tool to incite anger about the revolution. And I just wanted to kind of do this exercise because this type of analysis is what we like students to be able to do when they're making sense of sources in history. Now add to this other sources that might disagree with this perspective, and then you're cooking with oil, right? So excellent job. By the way, I don't think Paul Revere actually did that illustration. It was the artwork of a guy named Henry Pellman, just for clarity. I wouldn't want to be misquoted. So excellent job. So what I want to show you here is kind of the overview of the iterations of the history design team on Project Ready, beginning in 2011 and 2012, all the way kind of through the end of the project. And early on, it was, down here you can see what classrooms we were in initially and the design team teachers we were working with. And so we were specifically in middle grades US history and AP US history at first. And the initial kind of purpose or work done in the first iteration was really to prototype some historical inquiry units and get them into these classrooms so that we could see what was going on when we give students these types of sources and tasks to do. As you move forward through the project, we began collaborating and designing with the teachers in their classrooms. So as a graduate student and as a, I guess you could say, a research assistant, right? We were often weeks at a time in these classrooms, working with these teachers, talking with them, debriefing with them, reflecting with them, seeing what worked and what didn't with their designs over the course of weeks and then semesters and then the academic year. It is in that context, in the second iteration, that I did my first study, which, as I already mentioned, was my research apprenticeship study that I did as part of the LS program. And what I did at the end of that iteration, actually, was I looked back at the data that we had collected, because we collected copious amounts of student work, annotations, we had videotaped lessons, small group audio recorders. There was a lot of different sources of data, but having an interest and a background in writing, I wanted to specifically attend to the students' source-based writing. So I was interested in the writing tasks in which they used multiple sources to make an argument and write them out. If any of you are familiar with AP US History, it is a DBQ. They call it a document-based question. They get multiple sources, and they have about an hour to complete the task and write an essay. So it's probably a little bit too much context for you up front, but so kind of diving into this first study, I was interested in looking at student source-based writing and seeing whether or not I could see development in their reasoning, their historical reasoning, over the course of the year from beginning to end. And so taking all the essays they had written in a year and whittling it down to just the ones that used multiple texts, because again, that was the interest on the project as well. I ended up with 3 sets of essays across 3 different sections of the class. And again, the kind of the driving questions for this study was, what's going on in these essays? What can we learn about students' reasoning from these essays? And then did it look different from beginning to the end of the year? And so the instructional context, again, it was an AP US History class. It's important to know that because there was this constant tension about making sure we got to all the content in the year. They had to cover all of American history, right, within that academic year, in addition to kind of meeting the goals and the demands of being part of Project Ready as well. And so, again, it was a diverse suburban high school district in the Midwest. They were a major city, a major urban city, and these essays were completed in preparation for completing the AP exam at the end of the year. So at the end of the year, they take the AP exam. There's a DBQ that they have to complete. So a lot of these were like the practice DBQs that they completed leading up to the test. Those 3 sets of essays I was able to get from 16 participants, holding consistent across all the classes, and they were collected in October, December, and May. Those were kind of the 3 data points. So ideally, you're going to see, a starting point, a middle point, right, and then glorious historical reasoning at the end of the year, right before their exam in May. So, kind of want to introduce you briefly to the tasks themselves. In October, there was a Native American removal task in which the prompt asked them to support, refute, or modify, a very common prompt in history classes, the statement, the United States developed a policy of open aggression and annihilation towards the Native Americans. They could support, refute, or modify it. And as you can see, there were a serious number of sources for that task. There were 15 primary sources, 6 of which were visual, graphic images of the Native Americans and the Trail of Tears, about circa like 1860 or so. And some illustrations as well. The second was Lincoln's speeches. How did Lincoln's speeches reflect the changing course of the Civil War? So that was his inaugural addresses, the Gettysburg Address, along with the Emancipation Proclamation. Total of 4 sources. Note they're a bit longer, each one of those individually. And so the teacher focus at that point was getting students to attend to the language use of the sources, right? Like, what are the words Lincoln is using to describe what's going on? And then change over time. How do you describe kind of change over time? Finally, the Vietnam tensions essay at the end of the year was very much a traditional DBQ. In fact, I think it was the 1998 DBQ that was modified for practice interclass, and the focus of which was how the Vietnam War affected things on the home front, basically. Socially, economically, and politically. Clarifying question, yes?
Yeah. Can you talk about the Native American removal prompt? Because to me it seems like would they be able to argue against that with the sources that they were provided? Or is this more like a loaded situation where it's like, how could you argue against that with these sources?
That's an excellent question. So again, this is towards the beginning of the year. So one of the purposes of the assignment was to build out the students' capacity for analyzing visual sources, which is kind of what we just did together a moment ago. They were not necessarily one-sided. So for instance, one of the images was a photograph of 3 Native American children that had been basically dressed in traditional American garb. They had been kind of stripped of their Indianness. And so the purpose of that, the caption kind of describes like, this is what happens when these students were, or these kids were assimilated, right? And one could argue with that one text that, look, this benefited the Native Americans, it wasn't open aggression, we were helping them in some way. Whereas a more kind of critical perspective of that source would be, well, this is clearly, you know, a forced assimilation and these kids had to give up their heritage and their culture. So, so yes, the prompts were designed to be able to argue from both sides. But I also want to mention now, since you've kind of raised it, that it was also in the teacher's interest to raise the difficulty of the texts as the year went on. Visual text being a little more quicker to process, perhaps, and so the kind of excerpts were smaller at that point. Lincoln's speeches, much longer texts, much denser, and then the last one was, again, a practice DBQ, so it was pretty kind of cookie cutter for the test. So, does that answer your question, Rachel? Thanks. So in terms of the analysis I did with this essay corpus, I used a modified rubric from Chauncey Montesano, who does a lot of work in argument and historical reasoning, and I used her rubrics to score for claims, evidence, and reasoning statements at the sentence level. So, you know, what is the quality of the historical claims they're making in these essays? In terms of evidence of their historical reasoning, I attended to their use of background knowledge. Is there evidence that they understood change over time? Perspective taking, chronology, significance, those are kind of the elements of historical reasoning that I looked at or attempted to. And then finally, I did a pretty extensive analysis of the students' use of the sources, because I knew the sources and I had the essays, and we also had, you know, video evidence of what they did in class leading up to these tasks. So I was actually able to like see what parts of the sources they used in their essays, whether they, the form, so were they directly quoting, summarizing, paraphrasing, pretty thick textual analysis of their use of the sources. All that to say is there wasn't a lot of change, so I'm not going to bore you with the graphs because they're pretty flat. Plus, it wasn't a giant corpus of data, so it wasn't like I was looking for statistical significance with this qualitative analysis. But in terms of argument, there was no change in the quality of argument over the course of the year. In terms of their evidence of historical reasoning, again, there was evidence of it, you know, here and there, but it didn't like peak. We didn't see a going up of these kind of categories. And then finally, in terms of the source use, there really was no changes except that the frequency and quality of the student source use peaked with the Lincoln task. And so you can kind of perhaps surmise why that is. If you go back real quick to the tasks, if you notice, kind of very obviously here, each one of these tasks demands different things of the students. They're asking for different things, and because of that, I wasn't able to see change over the course of a year. Instead, it was a smattering because this wasn't a researcher-created task. I didn't do a pre and post test, you know, holding the students kind of, you know, the task demands were very different. So I didn't, you know, see a lot of interesting things. So all that to say is the source characteristics and the task characteristics kind of drove the findings. Again, the difficulty of the text was all over the place. The things you could attend to in those tasks were different. And again, we saw peak performance of the Lincoln speeches task. And part of my thinking here was also that the writing quality wasn't necessarily great either. So was the students' perhaps lack of skills in writing interfering with their ability to communicate historical reasoning in their essays? Was something I asked. And finally, again, the kind of the striving force here was ecological validity. I didn't create a task and drop it into the classroom. All that to say is this isn't exactly kind of a surprising result here either. Here's some more seminal kind of literature that I had read prior to all this work, but it really started to click and make sense for me after I had done the study, which Bereiter and Scartamaglia in '87, they talk about how novice writers or non-expert writers, they do a lot of knowledge telling when they're using sources, so they kind of copy, paste. And experts, they'll transform the knowledge before they ever actually inscribe it, so knowledge transformation versus just knowledge telling. And then Young and Leinhardt, 1998, they actually used 11th grade AP US history students, and again, they saw that students tend to report information rather than creating an interpretation of the past when they're using multiple sources in writing. I think I knew this, but again, for the sake of the project, I feel like I wasn't quite paying attention. It's kind of also important to note at this point that there were interesting things going on in the classroom. Students were able to reason historically, and we know that from their classroom discussions and from their individual annotations on sources and the whole classroom discussions that they were having, both in small groups and as a whole class. So it's not like things weren't going on. It was that both my design and the tasks itself kind of interfered. So.
Wait, you have 2 questions.
2 questions.
Yeah, thanks. With the Bereiter and Scardomalia,
is it Bereiter? Bereiter, right? Yeah, I think.
Okay, I'll take your word for it. So, I'm interested in the distinction between expertise in writing and expertise in the content area or the discipline, and I'm just wondering what that refers to. Are these non-expert writers as writers of anything, or are they non-experts in a particular discipline, and that could vary with their expertise from one discipline to the next?
That's a good question. That piece in particular, I don't think was in the domain of history, and I'm trying to remember now. Anybody you know offhand? Yeah.
So they did studies with a number. This is a generalization across a number of different kinds of experts that they made in this particular piece.
Mm-hmm.
In general, their work was not discipline specific when they worked with kids. And in general, all of the work they've done to facilitate writing in their online systems, like First Cecil and then Knowledge Forum, has used generic prompts, like, my theory is, I need to know more about. So they're not, of course, what makes sense to put after the prompt is highly discipline specific, especially as you get older and are doing more detailed thinking about the discipline. But the prompts themselves that they were working from are generic. And these are generic claims based on generalizing across multiple experts in different disciplines.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
So that sort of gets at a question I had, which is, was there an analysis, maybe I just missed it, between a link between attentiveness to the specific task at that time and the way that they were using sources at that time? So you talk about this in sort of looking across all of it, but was there an attentiveness to, at this moment, with this focus and goal of the teacher, what does that,
right,
do we see positive?
After the fact, like as I was kind of constructing this, as the kind of in the process of doing the research and looking at this, yes, there was this kind of instructional mapping of like, look, during the Lincoln speeches in December, like right before their pizza party and break, they spent a lot of time just explicitly working on writing instruction, actually. And the instructional time dedicated to producing this essay was double in the middle. And so, again, when you situate it within that context, there's more explanatory power behind kind of the null result, for sure. So, excellent. Well, I appreciate the interruption. It gave me a chance to have a sip. So, moving kind of towards the end of the project, as the project began to focus on the randomized control trial in science, the work of the history team really became to publish and begin to make sense of everything that was going on. And so I, around that time, defended my proposal and began data collection at the end of the, I think 15, 16? Surely I know this. One of those years, I collected data, and I'm going to kind of tell you a little bit about that. Just one more note about the
RCT was 14, 15, if that helps. Might not, but.
Then it was 14, 15, I think. I will correct this. But I just want to kind of mention this work around this time. The history team had, here let me show you this map just to contextualize it. This learning goals progressions in iteration 3. This was a mapping of the learning goals over the course of the academic year. And the work of the history team, we built out this giant spreadsheet. What you see here is probably a 80% reduction of what we had. But we really wanted to see our learning goals kind of charted across development. Now, this is not to be confused with like a learning trajectory or learning trajectory research, which is more tied to students' developmental abilities. This was very much instructionally, where do we see our learning goals progressing over time? And so that's, I can't give you a chance to read this because I want to move along, but that was kind of the thing that was going on at the time, which kind of shifted my thinking towards what these things look like in process rather than in product. So moving towards a dissertation, here's kind of my rationale or pitch, and you can evaluate it as you'd like. My argument is, researchers and teachers also, but a lot of the research on historical reasoning, they rely and depend on students' essays, these products of their reasoning, to make claims about what kids can and cannot do in history. I mean, this is not surprising. Teachers use essays all the time to assess. History teachers don't view writing as their job, right? They usually think about this as the work of the English teacher. However, they use this as a site to make claims about what students can or cannot do. I remember even in my own history class, in my own AP history class, the teacher constantly writing reasoning question mark across my DBQs, and I'm like, what are you talking about? Like, I don't even know what you mean, right? It didn't make sense to me at the time. He was a great teacher, but that's not the point. And so my argument here is really that student essays offer a problematic small window into students' historical reasoning. Again, we saw reasoning in their discussions, we saw reasoning in their small groups, in other places, but in the essays themselves, they tended to fall short, or a little bit short. So with that, I kind of want to clarify a little further my thinking about historical reasoning as it's shifted. There's a forthcoming chapter in a book next year from von Boxtel and Van Dree, kind of clarifying their model for what historical reasoning is. As you probably heard, I've kind of used historical thinking and historical reasoning interchangeably, as a lot of research has done. They stick with the reasoning term, and they really put history thinking into two categories: first order knowledge and second order knowledge. The first order knowledge being, the history content stuff. So knowledge of events, perhaps, like the Salem witch trials. Structures, so again, like the feudal system would be a structure. Themes, which is like, with the Salem witch trials, tensions between church and church membership and state, perhaps. Concepts being like modern imperialism, perhaps manifest destiny, you could argue. And then chronology, which is, ordering and timing of sources and events as well. So what happened first, what happened later, in broad swaths. And then the second order knowledge, they call meta-historical concepts, which is moving towards more of the work of historians. So the argumentation and use of evidence piece, thinking about change over time, again with the Lincoln speeches task, as well as other things like having historical empathy, understanding significance of sources and events, and contextualization and all that. So I just kind of wanted to offer that because, again, I've kind of moved my thinking from my first introduction to historical thinking from really the seminal work of Weinberg and the three things, sourcing, contextual corroboration, and then over time I'm thinking about these things in writing and as kind of the discipline and these few researchers that are talking about this kind of offer new terms and ideas or ways of thinking about historical reasoning, my thinking has changed as well. So that's my meta-commentary on my thinking, so to speak. So all that to say is the second study really sought to look at the gap between thinking and writing. So the kind of phrasing of the research question at the moment is, what more can we learn by looking at the processes of student reasoning, the writing process, versus solely the product. So we look at just the product, we get this view of what historical reasoning they're doing, what happens when we kind of unfold what they're doing as they're reasoning. And so the use of think-alouds is, not new to historical reasoning research. Again, I mentioned the Weinberg study in which he had historians do think-alouds back in '91, and they've been used since. For my design, I used concurrent think-alouds. So I wanted students to be thinking aloud from soup to nuts, from the time they sit down with the task through the finished product of the essay. Again, this happened kind of on the tail end of the project, and so at the end of the year, I have kind of one data point in which I identified 8 participants, 9, one didn't finish, to complete a source-based writing task. And again, the task I didn't design myself. It was something the teacher was going to use in her class. And so I took it from the teacher's curriculum. And I had the students that were my Think Aloud participants do a 45-minute Think Aloud training exercise. So while all the other students were actually writing the essay the day they were going to do it in class, my participants didn't. And they participated in this training. And I'm kind of proud of the training because it was, I think it was interesting. I had students pair up with each other, the 8 participants. They had recorders just for the sake of having it audio recorded. And they practiced talking aloud to each other with a set of unrelated historical sources and tasks about, I believe it was the civil rights movement. And so they got to practice what it was like thinking aloud while reading. They also practiced thinking aloud while writing. Again, it's a demanding task, so very few students ever said anything as they were writing that was a comment. In fact, most of the time they would talk aloud what they were writing, like, in this date, this happened, and then they would comment on that after the fact. So all that to say is 8 participants completed this, and I did a brief, semi-structured post-task interview in which I simply asked them, did you write everything you wanted to write? And how do you think you did? But really, did you include everything in the essay that you wanted to include? And that was a brief 3 to 5 minute kind of interview. Students on average took 72 minutes to complete it. So, to note the difference, they took longer to do this, to think aloud and do this, than the students who had 55 minutes in their class that day to actually write the essay. However, the essays were, the essay set of the class was very similar to the essays that the students produced in the Think Aloud condition. Sorry, I keep doing this. I'm realizing I'm like waxing on and waxing off. The task itself, students were asked to compare and contrast the development of New England and Chesapeake regions. And for those of you still fuzzy on your American history, there were kind of 2 big groups of English colonies. Of the 13 original, you have the New England colony, and then you have the Chesapeake. And the question really asks, prior to 1700, compare and contrast the development of these 2 colonies. How did they end up different or the same over the course of that period? And so the source set, if you kind of just peruse it for a moment, the first 3 really attended to New England, so it gave you one side, and then 4 through 7 gave you a perspective of what was going on in the Chesapeake colony. And so just for a moment, I'm just, how much time do we have just to gauge it?
I don't know, another like 10-ish minutes.
10-ish.
Is that okay?
Yeah, no, that helps me kind of judge what I'm not going to show you. I just want to introduce you quickly to the first source to give you an idea, because some of the data I'm going to try to show you is couched in part in this source. So this is John Winthrop, Puritan governor of the Massachusetts, or the New England colony, further north, written in 1630. And so kind of the emphasis here, I just want to point out, is that they were to strive together to be a city on a hill. It's a very kind of famous point that history teachers like to make, and that sentence is right here. We must consider that we shall be a city upon a hill. So they were going to, show the world, the eyes of all people are upon us, show the world that they could make it as this kind of separatist Christian community moving over. So the motives for the New Englanders, the Puritans, to come were different than that of the other colonies, which were much more motivated by wealth, gold, self-driven interests. Most of the immigrants coming to the South were indentured servants, and they were looking to kind of make it on their own. So, all that to say is the protocols were transcribed verbatim, parsed into comments, and my initial kind of coding work focused on just getting familiar with the data and distinguishing when students are reading, when students are writing, just to kind of get into it. So, when are they reading which source, and what are they doing with it? And then writing practices. Are they outlining? Are they drafting? Are they annotating? Are they revising? And then I built thick descriptive analytical memos of each one of the participants' think aloud to get a little more familiar with what's actually going on inside these, attending to not only their use of sources and background knowledge, but also what claims are they making, what comparisons between the colonies are being made in both the essays and the think alouds. So at the moment, I'm calling this like a comparative case analysis because I'm looking across. I'm still trying to figure out what exactly these are cases of, I guess is the fair way to put it. So real quick, I want to introduce you to Haley. This is her thesis from the essay. I was going to pass out the essay and have you take a look at it, but for your own sake, I won't do that today. But this is kind of her thesis in the essay. Prior to 1700, although New England and Chesapeake regions had a singular political structure, they differed in their motives for settlement and social structure. So she's saying, this is one of the strategies that the teachers teach them. You say they're a little similar, but really they're different, right? So she's kind of given this measured judgment, if you will, saying that they have a singular political structure. The interesting thing is, if you did see the essay and went just on the essay alone, her claim about having a singular political structure doesn't match the thinking that's actually evident in her think aloud. She contradicts herself multiple times. So regarding this first source with John Winthrop, she actually says, well, he was the one that was known for his beliefs in like a city on a hill and how he wanted Massachusetts and the New England colonies to be a village that was very conscious, I think, of like what they're doing so that they could be like a model towards like other colonies, which is why he believes in living on a city on a hill, because like everyone can see and like So if you delete the likes, you can kind of make sense of what she's saying here. But what I want to point out in this top excerpt is that Haley is reading the source for the first time, and before she even really gets past the sourcing information, she knows things about it. So she's bringing background knowledge to bear, and she demonstrates some emergent understanding of the significance of this source for the New England College. Later, after she's drafted kind of this part of her essay, where she drops in source one, notice it's a source reference. Real quickly, she says, unlike those who lived in the New England colony who were motivated by being motivated better the village as a whole. So she was trying to say the Puritans were motivated to stick together and succeed, whereas it was different in the other colony. But her source reference, she doesn't actually talk about the source. She references the source and mentions the idea, but she never kind of addresses the source in a kind of a direct way. Later on, she's, when considering writing more about this source in particular and including more of the complex thinking and ideas she had earlier, she says, she points to her section of the essay and the source. She's like, well, this is similar to this, but I'm just going to focus on this. She basically doesn't end up writing any more about that topic. So just some initial takeaways from her think aloud in particular. She makes multiple claims with evidence while she reads and plans her essay that do not end up in the essay. She struggles with the writing task quite a bit. She seemed to have trouble tracking what she had already included versus what she wanted to write, kind of her goals for the writing itself. And she struggled to connect the extent of her background knowledge to the source set and her essay. She had used copious amounts of background knowledge. I've now used the word copious twice. Sorry, I'm just attending my own language use, but she used a ton of background knowledge that never ended up in the essay. However, she did bring it to bear to analyze the sources. So just to kind of wrap up real quickly, So far, we're kind of seeing three broad swaths of results. First, the students, the 8 participants, are using a lot of background knowledge, domain knowledge, that is relevant to the argument that doesn't end up in the essay. They use it to reason and make sense of the sources, and they kind of have this emergent understanding of what they're really being asked to do, but it falls flat, and all the essays pretty much look the same, with some variation. Also, the think alouds are showing levels of chronological thinking that students are tracking as they process the sources. So this happened before that, and they're tracking that as they go, certain students. And then finally, what's of particular interest to me are the additional comparisons that students are making that don't end up in the essay. The task is to compare the colonies and offer comparative points, right? Argue whether they are alike or different, compare and contrast the development of the colonies. And so I'm particularly interested in instances where they do it, they talk about it, they've processed it, they even write it down in their outline if they make an outline, but it's just nowhere to be found in the actual product. So first point here, Haley, back to Haley, the use of relevant background knowledge. I just want to point out in this excerpt from her actual, from her Think Aloud, she talks about how the Virginia colony had an agricultural-based economy, while the New England colonies had a mixed economy and trade because they had rocky soil. Basically, Virginia could grow tobacco. That really wasn't an option for New England. She knew this. She talked about it. Very valid comparison, actually, that could have supported her argument, and she had evidence from her own background knowledge, doesn't make it into the essay. And other participants kind of give us an idea of why this is. Andrea, one of the participants said, but they don't really talk about it in the documents. So the student didn't feel like they had the either agency or ability, or they shouldn't necessarily include things that weren't in the documents that they knew to be true that would have supported their argument. Second swath, I'll just kind of briefly go over this, the chronological thinking piece. Grace, in reading the second source, she says, Document 2, Articles of Agreement, written and signed by 8 Puritan men, Springfield, Massachusetts, 1636. So she begins annotating, she circles the date, and then she says, so this is 6 years after the Puritans came, referencing Document 1, the other guy. John Winthrop, sorry. And then later on, same participant, reading aloud, she says about Nathaniel Bacon. He was a rebellious volunteer militia in Virginia. This happened in 1676, which was 3 years after Governor Berkeley needed help for the wars with the Indians. So as she's going through these documents, she's keeping the date in mind, trying to make sense of when things happen. Does it matter for the task? Not necessarily. So you're not going to necessarily see that in the final essay. And then finally, again, the kind of the most interesting piece to me, where the real money is for these think alouds, is the cases in which they didn't include comparisons that they made during the think aloud in the essay. Back to Haley, she says, the reasons for similarities and differences would be, so she's kind of brainstorming here ideas. The Virginia colony had the House of Burgesses. This is their form of government. And the Massachusetts, they only had town hall meetings, as opposed to the House of Burgesses. This happens earlier on in her Think Aloud. She's kind of surfacing background knowledge. It's interesting that in her thesis, she writes they had a singular political structure. Contradicts the point she just made. So one thing that might be going on here, she thinks that, well, they're all under the control of England still, so they still had a singular political structure. She would be right if that's what she explained. She didn't. But she's contradicting her point. And then before writing the conclusion, she actually drafts this. She writes, in the Virginia, in the Chesapeake regions, they were governed by the House of Burgesses, while in the New England colonies, they were governed by, not town hall meetings, so she's maybe a little tentative about it. They were maintained, governed, so she's trying to think of the word, and maintained because they had like the closely knit together thing, which she already wrote about, that they had governed and maintained by multiple town hall meetings. So then she says, okay, so how am I going to put that into, and so she's trying to think about how this works into her argument, where it fits, where can she stick it into her essay. Mind you, they're not typing, they're handwriting these out, which makes, I think, a significant difference here. And then she says towards the end, there isn't anything in here that says anything about the House of Burgesses, flipping back through the sources. And I want to put that in here because it's part of my thesis. But I kind of already have something close here because the city on a hill. So she's like, I already talked about this source, so I think I'm covered, right? But in fact, she left out a very valid part of her argument that would have supported one of her points. Doesn't know where to put it, doesn't include it. So I find that kind of very interesting. And so just some notes about the method itself, which I talked about at a conference last week. The Think Aloud methodology, the concurrent think alouds in particular are time consuming. And so students' annotations, you might be able to get at their thinking. If you look at that in conjunction, it might show some in-process historical reasoning. Students, this is a hard task for them to do, to talk aloud and think and process and write. And so, again, they're not thinking aloud and writing at the exact same moment. They're alternating between drafting, talking aloud, and thinking aloud. I just want to mention, as with any think aloud methodology, there's always this threat of reactivity, which is the very fact that you're doing a think aloud may in fact facilitate more historical thinking. So, that might be a threat. In my data set in particular, because these essays are so similar to the essay set of the classes that also wrote the essay, just on a kind of comparative level, I think I've kind of addressed that. And then generally, I'm moving between the essays and their think alouds, and I'm looking at kind of multiple units of analysis. And so it's something that I struggle with, just kind of looking across these forms and types of data. So with that, just some implications. I would argue, and if you come to my defense someday, I think I will argue that the students' reasoning in their think alouds is more complex and can be inferred just from the essay itself. And then thinking about, as a group of researchers that study historical reasoning, moving beyond just essays and trying to make quips or using anecdotal evidence to say things about what kids can think and do, we should be pairing other sorts of complementary data like chat logs, there's input logs, keystroke loggers of that sort. And then finally, I kind of like the methodology, it's quite fun, and if students talk, they can be really rich. So I think this is a valid way of investigating historical reasoning. And so with that, I leave you, and I will entertain your questions and feedback.